Greetings. As promised, this episode's going to be about how I think about problems. It's difficult for me to make this episode because the English language doesn't, as far as I'm aware anyway, have the words to describe how I think about a problem in indirect terms. I like to avoid using similes, analogies, metaphors, that kind of thing in speech because they're inherently somewhat culturally loaded. So in order to use a metaphor or an analogy, I have to assume that you understand what I mean by that thing. And because I don't know who you are as I'm recording this, that's inherently a little bit dangerous. Unfortunately, because of the nature of those two things, I'm forced, if I want to talk about how I think, to use an analogy. And I want to. I've tried to pick something that's as universal as I can think of, but I apologise to you if culturally you don't know what Lego is. The analogy for how I think that I can give you is that initially I'm aware of the existing pieces of the situation as though they're sort of out of focus assemblies of Lego bricks, and I'm aware of the solution I'm looking for as though it's an out of focus assemblage of Lego bricks. And over time, as I understand the problem in more detail, what we're trying to achieve in more detail, I get better clarity on all of those shapes, until at some point I see where it is I need to break things apart, reassemble them in order to achieve the outcome that we're looking for. I want to be extremely clear that I don't experience thoughts as though they're shapes or solids or anything like that. That's just the closest real world feeling to how it is to think about a problem that I could locate. I've spoken with other people about how they think, and some of them have told me that their primary mode of thinking is an internal dialogue between both sides of themselves, but they're asking questions and getting answers, and that's how they make progress on an idea. I have some limited experience with that way of thinking, in that I can kind of force my mind to work that way, although it's not its preferred way of working. And I do find that particularly useful when I'm planning how I'm going to communicate an idea or a conclusion to other people. To have that internal conversation first is often useful. Of the people I've spoken to about how they think, the majority have told me that they experience internal images, visualizations, and that for them it's much the same experience to think about something as it is to see something. For a very long time, I thought that visualization and so forth was just a metaphor, in the same way I used the Lego example earlier. It seemed, a not terrible metaphor for how I think, but it was a few years ago I found out that no, actually the majority of people appear to really see pictures inside their minds, which I find quite fascinating. My mind just in general doesn't do that, except in some highly specific rare circumstances that are unrelated to my software engineering. So I find that whole world fascinating. I can't give you any tips that are going to be specifically helpful to you if you are a very visual thinker naturally, because it's something I have no experience with. I've told you how it is I think, and how I've heard other people say that they think, because I think it's interesting that we don't all think about problems in the same way, or in some of these mechanisms are really very different to each other. It's been useful to me to know how I think, what the strengths of that way of thinking are relative to the other ways of thinking, and what the weaknesses are. And it's helpful for me to be surrounded by other people who don't all think in the same way that I do, because there are going to be problems that are naturally easy to solve if you're a visual thinker, and there are going to be problems that are naturally easy to solve if you're a dialogue thinker, and there are going to be problems that are naturally easy to solve if you think the way that I think. And those sets of problems are not all that. It's not the same easy for everyone. It doesn't work like that. And so having access in your team to people who think in these different ways, and if there are other different ways out there, to those different ways, is an advantage, because it means any problem that you as a team encounter, it's more likely to be easy to solve for one of you. The challenge, of course, is when we come to communicate ideas, it's probably easier to communicate with people who think in the same way that you do. It's very rare for me to encounter someone who does think in the same way that I do, so I don't actually really know how easy that would be. But I've noticed that if I'm in a situation where the majority of people are visual thinkers and the information's being given out by a visual thinker, that those other visual thinkers have an easier time picking up what's being communicated than perhaps that I do. A few moments ago, I essentially hand-waved away the whole series of steps that occur between I have a vague understanding of what the problem is and what the situation is, and now the problem is solved. And in a sense, it was fair of me to do that, because every problem is a different situation. Therefore, the steps to get from that initial situation to the solution that you want are different from one problem to the next. But I think it's useful for me to tell you a couple of strategies that I found helpful to get me from that fuzzy place to the place where we have the answer. The general way of things is, if someone's asking me to solve a problem, then the problem doesn't have an obvious answer. And that's, I think, generally going to be true for you throughout your careers as well. If the answer was there, they wouldn't be asking you to solve it. They'd just be asking you to do this piece of programming. Someone told me very early in my career, I'm sorry, I've forgotten exactly who, or I would credit them, that actually it might be better not to think of what we do as trying to find an answer to the problem as it was posed to us, but what we're trying to do is find another way of phrasing the question such that the answer is then obvious. And I've found in my career that there's quite a lot of truth to that, not least because if you solve the problem that way, rather than having here's a question and here's a non-obvious solution, that's quite a tough sell to get people to, sometimes can be a tough sell to get people to recognize that solution does in fact solve the problem. Whereas if you can rephrase the question in a way that they recognize is equivalent to the original question and then has an obvious answer to go with it, that's an easier journey for them to go through to accept that you have in fact solved the problem. So instead of telling you how I solve a problem, I'm actually going to tell you how it is I try to generate different questions that, perhaps in the hope of finding the question that's equivalent to the original problem that has an obvious answer. I find that generally when I'm given a problem, it's in obviously like not totally specified terms, it never is, and there's some amount of unstated and don't break this, and there's a lot of unstated, and here are the existing systems that we want to continue to work, or here are the existing systems that we have, but actually we don't care if you restructure this stuff. So I like to spend a reasonable amount of time, well, the amount of time it takes to get as far as you're going to get in terms of answers, finding out like what other people think the question is, because it's usually pretty similar to the one you were given, but not necessarily exactly the same, and that those differences can be highlighting. I like to find out as much as I can about the existing systems, why they are the way they are. It can be very relevant as well. And so once I've got that information, though, well, there is, as I say, a chance that in those conversations, the question with an obvious answer has already popped up, in which case, happy days, you're done. Once I've got as much information as it's practical to get, if I don't already have the ideal question, I find that if I really concentrate my mind, or, not even really concentrate, like pay any reasonable amount of attention to the question, that attention in my mind acts to freeze the things in place, so they can't. It fixes my perspective on the way I was originally asked the question or the way I'm currently thinking about it now. And when the task is to find another way of looking at the problem, another way of asking the question, that's super unhelpful. Now, I noticed that this was how my mind worked because, like, so many times I'd be stuck on something at work for a few hours, get to going home time, and then midway or towards the end of my commute home, I'd go, oh, right, yeah, that's the answer to this thing, or that's the new question I've been looking for. And that's quite frustrating because, I'd rather have my evening be thinking about something other than work. And also, I'd rather not be sat at work for hours at a time, blocked on this thing, and then hoping that I solve it in the back of my mind as I commute home. But I found, as I've got older and more experienced with this, I'm better at recognizing when I'm in the early stages of being stuck in one of these ruts. And it's easier for me to say, okay, the way I will progress this is by, setting it aside and doing something else for a brief period of time. It does seem to be that the longer I have had it fixed in that one way of thinking, the harder it is to change. So if it's 10 a.m. and I'm in this, okay, I'm looking at this, it's not a helpful way of phrasing the question, I need to generate something new. If I sit at my desk and concentrate on that problem for the rest of the day, I'm pretty sure I will make no progress, is one thing. And then it will take perhaps 3 or 4 hours of not looking at it in order to generate the answer, but maybe much more, because depending on, how fixed it's become in my mind. I'll tell you, the worst case of this I ever had was when I was running my own business, and there was a technical problem I really wanted to solve. And I obviously sort of existential level question actually for my business, whether I could solve this or not. So I really, really cared, which meant the times I was working, I was thinking about it. And the times I was not working, I was thinking about it. And I was stuck on this for probably 7 weeks, making absolutely no progress at all with the thing I was doing. And then it got to I think it was a Thursday, I don't know why I remember that. I just thought that I've been sat here for 7 weeks, or thinking about this for 7 weeks, just like almost in despair. Let's give up on this. And I went to the local driving range to work on my 3-wood swing, which still today needs work. But I managed to push the problem I had been working on completely out of my mind, and was just totally worrying about improving my swing plane. Anyway, about 2 hours after, on the way back from the driving range, I was like, oh, that's the way I should have asked that question I've been trying to solve for 7 weeks, and just unblocked myself. This is how my mind appears to work. It's very consistent in that behavior. I just have to learn how to exploit that to get problems solved in the most effective way. So when I recognize that I'm becoming stuck, even partially, on something, I know now that I have to sort of push it out of my mind, look at something completely unrelated, and then that will allow those pieces to reorient themselves in my thinking. And so if I get stuck on something, or start to get stuck on something about 10 in the morning, and I've genuinely got all the information I'm going to get, it's just I need to shift my perspective, take a 20-minute walk, and come back to it. My mind will generate other ways of thinking about the problem, and one of those will always be more productive than what I had before. So that's what I do now. If I have problems to solve, I will, look for the early warning signs of I'm getting fixed in one pattern of thinking and it's not a helpful pattern of thinking, and go and do something else to shake that pattern up. I don't expect that behaviour to be universal. I don't think everyone's mind would work in that same way, and there may be people for whom sitting at the desk and really concentrating hard is how they make the best progress. I guess my point is that we're all different. It's kind of on you to understand how you work. It's also important, though, that you understand not everyone's going to work in the same way, and if your favoured way of working or the way you make progress on something best is to lock yourself in a conference room with no distractions and like concentrate super hard on it, that's cool. But if you pull me in and assume that is going to work for me, then you're making a grave error, because my mind does not work like that. I can't make progress if I'm sat concentrating on the one thing the whole time. I will say also that before I resort to hoping my self-conscious generates new ideas, which I hesitate to say resort to because it's so reliable that it works that way, that it feels something I can lean on. But before I will do that, there are other things I can and do try that have been quite often useful. So I find I can force myself to take a different perspective on something, and there's kind of categories of perspectives that I can generally force myself to take. So one really good example that I found useful multiple times is to focus entirely on the data that's involved in some process. Like, where does it come from? Where does it need to go to? What needs to happen in between? And strip away everything else. So only thinking about this has to come in, be transformed in this way, and go out. And I don't care who's doing it, where they're doing it, how they're doing it, none of that is relevant in this question. It's just what's the data flow. And that can be really useful to highlight when you compare that to like your more complicated model of the real world. That can help to highlight, okay, here's an extraneous thing happening to the data that we don't need. So why would we take the time to do that when we've kind of established that we probably don't want that? You've got it can highlight, this transformation has to be done, and as you're thinking about that transformation, you think, well, like obviously that's owned by this team, but then in your real system it's being done by this team who shouldn't own it. So that kind of tactic of forcing a perspective can be really helpful. I mentioned the data perspective because that's applicable to quite a lot of problems. There's other ways to slice and dice this, but they tend to be a little bit more specific to the exact problem you're looking at, so I can't really give you a useful list. This is the end of episode 5. Next episode will be episode 7. I intend to talk about how to model problems and related topics to that. I hope you'll tune in again.